Tonight's about fighting nice, how we as individuals and as a community can disagree but stay together and even be friends and even love each other. So I want to share a brief teaching. And when a rabbi says he wants to share a brief teaching, just strap yourself in, put on the seatbelt. Could be anywhere between 15 and 30 minutes, but I will try to keep it on the short side. This is a teaching that comes from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Eruvin. For 3 years, we learn in the Talmud, there was a dispute between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, the former asserting the halakha is in agreement with our views, and the latter contending the halakha is in agreement with our views. So there's a serious argument going on in the Talmud about a legal matter, who's right and who's wrong. In this case, though, God intervenes. God intervenes in the conversation, and God announces Elu ve'elu, both of the words of Beit Hillel and of Beit Shammai are the words of the living God. But then God's voice continues, the halakha is in agreement with the rulings of Beit Hillel. But this is strange. If both of the rulings, both of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, are the words of the living God, then why does the tradition privilege the words of Beit Hillel? And so the Talmud gives us an answer. The Talmud tells us because Beit Hillel, they were kindly and modest. They studied their own rulings and the rulings of Beit Shammai. And they were so humble as to mention the actions of Beit Shammai before they mentioned their own actions. And because of these reasons, even though both of their rulings were the words of the living God, the tradition privileges the rulings of Beit Hillel. And that's what tonight is all about. How can we disagree? How can we be in machloket with one another and yet remain, like Hillel, kindly and modest, showing respect for one another, studying each other's rulings, each other's logic, and treating each other always with kavod, with respect. And so, are you ready to rumble? But nice, we're going to keep it nice. In this corner, they asked me not to do this, but I couldn't help myself because the Jewish Journal came up with this beautiful ad of them fighting nice. So I wanted them to wear robes, like silk robes, and have music and like dim the lights. And they said categorically, absolutely not. Except Eshman said yes. And then Suissa said no. Don't come up yet. I'm going to introduce you first. In this corner, right over here, weighing 195 pounds, standing 5'10", from Casablanca via Montreal, Canada, where he graduated from McGill University with a degree in business. Moved to Los Angeles in the early 1980s, the founder and CEO of Suissa Miller Advertising, one of the largest agencies in California. He sold the company in 2005 to dedicate himself full-time to Jewish community. He's the president of Tribe Media and the Jewish Journal for the past 9 years, and he's been writing a weekly column on the Jewish world that last year earned him top prize for editorial writing by the Jewish Press Association. He has 5 children, and he and his family live in Pico Robertson, a neighborhood you've heard of. That reminds him of his childhood in Morocco. It's David Suissa. Come on down. Please come sit right here. Okay. And in this quarter, I had to estimate height and weight because he didn't tell me. Standing 6 feet 9 inches tall, weighing 197, 183, but I said you were 6'9", so okay. But this part I know is right. From Encino, California, ladies and gentlemen, celebrated his bar mitzvah in the far-off land of this bima right here at Stephen Wise Temple. He's a graduate of Dartmouth College. He started his, got some applause for Dartmouth, fantastic. He started his journalism career as staff writer at the Jewish Journal in 1993. In 2009, he founded Tribe Media Corporation, reimagining the community paper for the future. Tribe Media produces the Jewish Journal, Tribe Magazine, JewishJournal.com, and the Jewish Insider, a morning e-newsletter, which if you're not on it, you should definitely get on the email list. I get it every morning, and it gives me a breakdown of all of the inside news for Jewish activists, politicians, and journalists. He and his wife, Rabbi Naomi Levy, have 2 children and live in Venice, California. It's Rob Eshman, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so we're going to get to it. We'll cover topics that Jews have lots of opinions about. Israel, can people see? I hope you can see. If not, you can move around the room to get more comfortable. We'll cover topics that Jews have lots of opinions about. Israel, the state and future of American Jewry, anti-Semitism, BDS, and politics. And since you're both journalists, we'll also talk about the state of journalism today as your own enterprise, the Jewish Journal, and Tribe Media. So our first question is going to focus on Israel. This week, Ehud Olmert became the first former, and hopefully the last, former Israeli prime minister to go to prison, beginning a 19-month term for bribery and obstruction of justice. What, if anything, does former Prime Minister Olmert entering jail mean vis-a-vis Israeli politics and society? What can it teach us about the state of the Jewish state today? Rob, why don't you go first?
God, I don't think Dave and I are going to disagree on this, but first of all, thank you for having us, Yoshi, and thank you, Glenn, for being one of the instigators behind this, and thank you all for coming in this torrential downpour. You know, I think it's a win for Israel in terms of the democracy. You know, what we love about Israel, and I think what's fundamental to our love for Israel is the fact that it's a democracy. And democracies root out bribery, they root out corruption, they root out wrongdoing, and they hold government officials accountable. And this is you know, I'm not going to say that the people that don't like Israel are going to look at that and say, okay, now we like it. But I think this is how a democratic society is supposed to behave, and I think it's a big win for Israel.
Well, first, I had this joke planned, so I'm going to say it anyways. This is the first time we've ever done this. So I think it's big kavod to your temple for this. And Rob and I decided that if this thing works, we're going to quit our jobs and take it on the road and make some real money. All right, because we're a very, very non-profit, the Jewish Journal. Always remember that. I like this first question because it reminds me very much of a dividing line in the Jewish world where so many of my friends on the left take the problems of Israel and they throw their hands up in the air and they said, it's the end. Democracy is ending. This is not the Israel that we wanted, that we dreamed about in the Declaration of Independence. There's a sense of alarmism whenever something bad happens in Israel. And Rob is right. We can't disagree on this one. I think just because we lived together all day long for the past 3 years, just crazy. Eventually, we sort of understand each other. And on this one, it's always been my point that, you know, there are two ways to look at the problems in Israel. And one way is to say, oh my God, a president got accused of rape. There's a president of Israel is in jail for rape. That's horrendous. What a shanda, what a busha, you know? So the other way to look at it is that the Chief Justice who sentenced the former president of Israel to jail is an Arab. He's an Arab Israeli. So I always sort of look at it that way, like Rob was saying, the fact that we're the only country in the Middle East by far who could even think of holding a leader accountable to the point where someone like Olmert or the previous president would go to jail. So I think it's an extreme demonstration of Israeli democracy, not that we should be proud of it either. You know, it is a shanda. But how do you improve yourself without this ability to have a corrective mechanism? You know, the whole idea that makes the mark of a great country is whether it has a corrective mechanism that enables itself to be better. And I guarantee you, the next prime minister of Israel is going to be very careful before he does something fishy.
A few years ago at a public lecture in Jerusalem, Tal Becker, a former guest of our congregation and a deputy legal advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu and a negotiator for the Israeli government, said that he fears that the Israeli policy of West Bank settlement is a bigger existential threat to Israel than the Iranian nuclear program. Now, this was a few years ago, and I don't know if his opinion has changed, but he said that the settlement enterprise is a bigger existential threat to Israel than the Iranian nuclear program. How do you respond to that claim?
Do you want to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
First.
I think we should.
My favorite comment on, hey, Rob's mother? Is that Rob's mother? Yeah. Great. Yeah, beautiful. Great. I love all mothers. My favorite, and Rob's father. Oh, beautiful. Great. He's got to help. Should have brought my family. Now, my favorite comment on the Palestinian crisis was from Yossi Klein Halevi, which is that leaving the West Bank is an existential threat to Israel. Staying in the West Bank is an existential threat to Israel. That captures the complexity like nothing else I've heard. So I think there's a tendency to sort of always stick on one side. And I think also it's human nature. When something is so complex, you sort of hold on to a simple idea. And you hold on for dear life. It provides comfort. And the one thing Rob and I have figured out over the years is that these things are not simple. So too often we here in America act as if, well, just leave already, right? Leave the West Bank. We act as if it's all in Israel's hands, but it's not. And what people call the occupation, just to give you one example of the complexity, just imagine Israel leaves the West Bank, and next thing you know, Hamas and ISIS comes in, and they chop off the heads of the Palestinian leadership. So you can look at it as occupation, but another way to look at it is that it's protection. So not that Israel should stay there indefinitely, but it's a really complex issue, and Tal Beck, who I have a lot of respect for, I think sometimes we get too alarmist when we say just, if we stay in the West Bank, it's an existential threat even bigger than Iran, because leaving is also an existential threat. That's why I lean with Yossi on this one.
Well, I think that Iran is an existential threat, that I think we've done that because of America, there's been a better chance of dealing with that threat right now. But also, the occupation is an existential threat. If Israel doesn't work out a way to end the occupation of the 2.6, 2.8 million Palestinians that live there, they either have to give them the vote and have them become citizens, or they have to accept the fact that there's going to be a Jewish minority in Greater Israel, and Israel wouldn't be a democracy. So you can't look, and that used to be kind of a distant threat. I mean, people were writing about this in 1967 after Israel captured the Six-Day War, the territories in the Six-Day War. The first thing the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, Levi Eshkol, said is, be careful of a gift like this, because it's an elephant who has to keep eating, and eventually it just is going to gobble up everything. And I think that you're going to have to deal with it. Now, I think where David and I disagree is, I think it has to be dealt with sooner rather than later, because the threat of doing nothing is getting to the point of an existential crisis for Israel. There's a whole other threat, which I'm sure Tal would agree with, is that there's a moral threat to Israel. That the occupation presents it's a source of moral decay in the center of Israeli society. And unless you pull out and you stop, denying these people their rights to their own elected government, controlling the land, controlling the resources, that eventually is going to corrode this real gift of Israeli society. So there's a threat there, and I think it has to be dealt with sooner. Where I think we agree is that I don't have the solution, and
but where we have a very healthy difference is stylistically, and Rob has incredible ability to keep his eye on the ball. So, and I see this every day. So we'll have some big explosion happen in Israel, and we're going to put it on the cover of the Jewish Journal. And somehow he's always able to keep his eye on the ball, to say that no matter what happens, the fundamental problem that we need to end the occupation is always going to be there. And so although he and I agree on the end goal, he's a lot more Ashkenazi than I am. He's tachlis, practical. He's almost cold-blooded in a healthy way, and I say that as a compliment. He stays calm, keeps it on the ball. Now, where I get maybe a little more emotional, and I get more, I don't know what the word is, but I have these timeout moments where I feel that so much of it is not in Israel's hands. I have a cynical view of things when it comes to who we're dealing with. In fact, it's so cynical that I think the biggest nightmare in the Palestinian Authority right now is if Bibi Netanyahu went to the United Nations and declared a Palestinian state. I happen to think that they have absolutely no incentive whatsoever to end the occupation. I see the occupation as this big knife that the Palestinian Authority uses to stab Israel, all day long. They marinate the society in Zionist hatred. So we've been telling them for 20 years that the most important thing for the future of Israel is the creation of a Palestinian state. Because if we create a Palestinian state, then Israel stays a Jewish democracy. So in a way, we're asking the biggest haters of Zionism to save Zionism. So I think that's not going to work. The occupation is also an ATM machine that brings in billions of dollars of international support. So I think, with my real hard-nosed, cynical view of things, I think it's the last thing they want is to end the occupation. In a way, I wish Bibi would figure that out. I think Arik Sharon figured it out. So Rob's genius is he always keeps on the ball. Maybe he has less of a cynical view, although now I think I've sort of moved him over on the cynical view.
No, I think it might be the last thing the Palestinians want, but I think it's the first thing Israel needs.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
I never thought that this had to be done as a favor to the Palestinians, certainly not as a reward to the Palestinians. This has to be done to save Israel. I mean, literally to save Israel. Because
Right, and my point is, because it has to be done for Israel, the Palestinians don't want to do it. It's precisely because of that. So I think this is why we ask ourselves, why do the Palestinians keep saying no? If you look at the history of the peace process, starting from Camp David right down to Olmert, you have all these excuses, but the bottom line is they did not act like a party that really wanted to make a deal. And I think one of the reasons is because they know how good it would be for Israel. So you're really trapped. It's almost like Israel is in a checkmate right now. They can't stay and they can't leave. And I have a feeling that the Palestinian leadership knows that. They know that we're checkmated. And they like it just the way it is.
I don't think it's a checkmate. I mean, I think that Israel still has agency, and Israel could do things to, incrementally to lessen the burden of occupation on the Palestinians and create trust and those kinds of things. But I also think that Israel at some point is going to have to make unilateral decisions. And Amos Oz has been talking about this for years, prophetically, and I think it's gotten to the point because there's been a government of Israel that's not interested in really pursuing peace as well as it should. And there's been a Palestinian partner that's pretty much non-existent. And so at some point, Israel's going to have to decide that it's not worth holding on to these places, and it's going to have to incrementally or in chunks let go of some of the territories, whether the Palestinians want it or not.
Yeah, I think Bibi's mistake is that he thinks that by saying we're ready to negotiate any time without preconditions, that he's off the hook. It doesn't work anymore. I think I agree with Rob on that. We have to prove to the world that a Palestinian state is in our interest, not in their interest. That, look, I think we're in a state of war. Maybe we have a point of difference on this one. I really think that we're dealing with someone who doesn't just not want to make peace, but who considers a Jewish presence in the Middle East like an offense, like, in a sense that they feel they got punished for what the Europeans did to the Jews, that they got punished for the Holocaust because they don't acknowledge that the Jews have a 3,000-year relationship with the land. So it's a very complicated narrative that you can't fix with negotiations and a border. The other thing is that their image of the Jew for centuries is David Suissa, the Dhimis in Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria and throughout the Middle East. Jews survived in the Middle East by being second-class citizens. That's how my ancestors survived in Morocco. So just think of that the only image they have of the Jew is as a second-class citizen who reports to them, and then all of a sudden these new Jews come from Europe, and not only are they not Dhimis, but they create this incredible thing called Israel, with democratic institutions and great universities and roads and infrastructure and everything. It's really offensive to them in a way. They don't know how to handle the new Jew.
I just think you have to be careful about saying them. I think that when you really parse Palestinian society, there's plenty of Palestinians who've been living with Israelis for over 60 years now, or longer, when you consider the pre-state Palestine, and really understand what they're dealing with, and that they're going to have to live with these people. I mean, and then you meet a lot of Palestinians who have come to accept Israel and Israelis, and you meet kind of the ones who will never accept no matter what, no matter if they give back territory, no matter what. And again, you don't do it so that they'll accept you or that they'll love you. You do it to save Israel as a democracy.
Let me ask a question about,
you can have a Marco Rubio moment.
Just keep reaching for it. Right? So you talked about cynicism and optimism, and I noticed, Rob, I stayed up very late last night reading all the articles you've written since 1997.
Oh.
Mainly just the headlines. But in a column you published in late December, the whole issue of optimism is a theme, a through line in the stories that you write. Just this last December, you wrote a piece called In Defense of Optimism, and you shared a variety of reasons to be hopeful in 2016. And you're such a prophet, I want you to know the stock market crashed 4 days later. So, but we're not holding you responsible for that. But in your, what, yeah?
Well, I'm just saying, my father's a stockbroker, and
It's his fault.
he said he's been doing it for over 60 years, right? So if you look over 60 years, there's every reason to be optimistic.
Okay. I just have to call my broker real quick and put in that. I got to stop that short sale. Okay. But you described the Iran deal in that article as last summer's historic agreement to deprive the Shiite theocracy of nuclear weapons. And you also wrote that we are far safer than if the deal had fallen through and Iran had raced for the bomb. This week, we read about the sale of the S-300 missile system to Iran and the potential delivery of Sukhoi multi-role fighter jets as well from Russia. Does this change the way you feel about the deal, and does it change in any way what you wrote at the end of 2015 in terms of your optimism?
No, because I never thought that we're making this deal with, that the fundamental nature of the Iranian regime was going to change, that the complexity of Iran that has its people who are going to be hardliners pursuing these options, pursuing more warlike options, and the people who are pursuing more moderate options was going to change, especially not overnight. I didn't think that the people who would profit from selling weapons to Iran that newly has $100 billion were going to, not do it. What I thought was that this was the best way to keep Iran from having a nuclear weapon within the next 10 to 15 years. And now I just read the Brookings Institution just released a report today that said they can't imagine, that under the current circumstances, they can't foresee Iran being able to produce a nuclear weapon until 2030. So I still think it was the best way to buy that kind of time. And nobody in this audience could predict what's going to happen in the world between now and 2030, or to the Iranian regime, or to the Middle East. So I'm optimistic about that. I wasn't delusional that it was going to change the nature of the Iranian regime or change the nature of international arms sales overnight.
David, you wrote back in August, you described the Iran deal as a blatant ripoff. Do you still feel that way? And if that's the case, is there anything that makes you feel optimistic about the agreement that was reached?
I actually feel worse about the deal now, especially after what I read this morning. I feel cheated by President Obama because he always made it look like the alternative is to go to war. And I thought that was just a cheap shot. He knows we don't want to go to war, especially after the debacle in Iraq. So it was always, well, we don't want to go to war, and this is the alternative to war is diplomacy. But then you read the piece in the New York Times this morning that the Pentagon had given him a whole option of, some sort of, what's the...
Cyber war.
Yeah, the cyber war, where they would take down... You see how we get along? It's great. He can finish even when I go against his argument, he helps me. By the way, he did this once. One of the reasons I love Rob so much, I was debating Peter Beinart in New York, and he was giving me ideas. Although Peter was on his side, Rob was giving me ideas for my debate with Peter Beinart. I'll never forget him for that.
You were representing. I didn't want you to lose.
So no, I really feel that, we could have made such a better deal. I thought we had a lot more leverage than what President Obama and Secretary Kerry, gave up, and they really acted like they were desperate to make a deal. And
in your experience as someone from that region, that's the best way to make a deal, right? Is show desperation at all times that you must make a deal. That's like
you're
the
in the
Eastern
souk
way,
and you
right?
tell them, I have to get that rug, or my wife is going to kill me. No wonder the price is going to go up, right?
It's the last one. I have to have it now. I think that's
And I don't even think Rob would disagree with me on this one. He knows we could have had a better deal. So for me, I just saw the missed opportunity. I really thought we had maximum leverage. After this morning, I thought we had even more leverage because it didn't have to be that all-out war that we all hate in terms of, an alternative to a deal. Look, this is, negotiating 101. If you can show the other side that you'll walk away and stuff, and this is what they did to us. So I think they turned the tables, and when you study the deal, which I've tried to study it, you see so many terms in there that are on their side, and I just think we could have made a much stronger deal.
I actually do disagree with David about this, and we wrote about it at the time. Yeah, there was a better deal to be had, but that's not what was on the table at the time. So the question is, are there better alternatives at this time to that deal? In other words, if we didn't ratify the deal, or not ratify, but if it didn't go through and it fell apart, is that a better alternative than having it go through?
Correct.
And I didn't think it was, and I still don't think it was, because at that time, and even now, I think that we'd be in a much worse place. There was a 3-month window to the bomb at the time the deal went through. Now they're saying 2030. So I do think it's a better, outcome, and I also think that, yeah, in some ideal world, there could have been a better deal, but I didn't understand why the Jewish community was so, most people in the Jewish community supported the deal, but why the most strident voices in the Jewish community kept saying they could have done better. They didn't.
Now, this is where we have a stylistic difference, whereas, it's true that, you look at it practically, this is all we've got right now, and what do we do? But I just didn't want to let President Obama off the hook. I said, I thought you could have had a much, much better deal, feel cheated by you, and I'm just going to tell you that. So I don't think you've deserved me to be practical right now. You haven't earned it. I think you got ripped off, and I'm going to tell you got ripped off, whereas Rob is just more practical.
Let me ask a question about the way Jews involve themselves in American politics in moments like this, and certainly something that you wrote about and that there was a lot of talk about over the summer. What should our role be? How should we assert our power? There are Jewish leaders who have called for American Jews to lobby United States legislators and officials to withhold or condition military aid to Israel upon Israel taking certain actions, like stopping settlements or reducing restrictions on transit in the West Bank. Do you think it's ever okay for American Jews to participate in an effort to modify Israeli state policy in so public a manner? And is it ever okay for Jews to act in a manner that effectively constitutes lobbying against aid to the state of Israel?
Yeah, it is. If you can't have really strong disagreements and you can't fight vigorously out of your love for the Jewish state, if you can't bring your full intellect to bear on the problems the state's facing and openly talk about it and debate it, then what's the point of having a Jewish state if you can't act like Jews? And I think it's important, and I think that you have to debate these issues out. I would also say that in my experience, especially if you look at the Oslo Times, the people who say you can't do those kinds of things publicly disagree with the Israeli government. During Oslo, they were very happy to publicly disagree with the Israeli government and demean Rabin and go out and protest in the streets against the Oslo Accord. With the current government, now they're against it. So you can't have it both ways. And I think, first of all, there's no way to shut Jews up. So even if we were to agree with that point, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because you're not, and everybody else is fighting about it. Everybody else, so the Jews shouldn't be. I think we have to weigh in.
David?
Well, God, there's no way you can shut Jews up. One of the things that drives me nuts in the Jewish world, when you have Jews that say they're trying to shut us up. Meanwhile, it's being printed in 20 papers. They're trying to shut me up. He's screaming in all the headlines. No, Jews, really, don't go for that line. It's not true. You can't shut a Jew up. I think, look, you got to be, I'll put on my practical hat here. If you really want peace, and if you want the Israelis in Israel to take risks for peace, what we've seen in the past is when they feel that we're supporting them, they're more likely to take risks for peace. I think President Obama's biggest mistake, it was a blunder that he never recovered from. His approval ratings were at 90% at the time. His first meeting he had with Netanyahu in 1st April of his tenure, he called for a complete settlement construction freeze, including the settlement blocks and East Jerusalem and so forth. That you're asking 500,000 Jews in Israel, they can't even build a patio anymore. Is a radical, draconian request that even the Palestinians had never asked for. And I don't think he ever recovered from that. So I think he sort of created a schism between Obama and the Israeli people. And the Israelis are more likely to take risks for peace if they feel we've got their backs. So although I'm all for criticism, God knows I've written, very public criticism of the Haredi monopoly and a lot of things in Israel that drive me nuts. I think we ought to take him on that. But when it comes to security, I think we have to just keep in mind that they're more likely to take risks for peace if we feel we have their back.
I agree that I agree with them, but it wasn't a radical, and I also agree that it was a really dumb move by Obama, the settlement freeze right out of the bat. But it wasn't any kind of radical, unusual thing because Bush had asked that. George W. Bush had asked that of Ariel Sharon in 2003. So it wasn't coming out of nowhere, the settlement freeze. I just think it's at your first meeting, it set the wrong tone and
Not really a first date move.
Yeah, it's not a first date
Or
move.
because the Palestinians sort of use it as an excuse to just sort of stay away from negotiations.
Let me ask you a question about growing up. You grew up in different places, although Casablanca and Encino are pretty similar in a lot of ways.
These days.
So tell us about any experiences you had growing up of anti-Semitism and how that might have shaped your own Jewish identity. And I'd love you to think a little bit about your fathers, think a little bit about the experiences your kids are having and maybe projecting into the future your grandchildren and how they might be similar or different than the experiences you had growing up, a sense of otherness or a sense of being a part of. So David, maybe you'll start and tell us a little bit about your childhood in Morocco and maybe in Montreal and experiences that you had around that and how they might have shaped your identity.
Oh, I'll tell you just three quick that just come to mind. In Morocco, whenever at Sadiqim, on the yard site, we would just go and spend a couple days where he was buried, and there'd be a lot of Arabs and Jews and, a few goats and stuff. And I'll just never forget, my mother was just, splitting a mgina, an omelet, and there was an Arab kid in the corner, and the Arab kid looked like he was really hungry. I just will never forget this moment. My mother served the Arab kid before her own children. So that was just a moment. She doesn't even remember when I tell her that, but it's a true story. I think I was 6 years old. That's one little episode. When we went
She did that to be polite or because she
just
had
felt
to?
she sees a hungry kid. Right. Rob knows my mother. Anybody's hungry, she'll feed him. Yeah.
Can you give me her phone number?
Thing with food. It's a thing with food. By the way, Rob has filmed my mother cooking lots of things. It's on JewishJournal.com. She makes the greatest soup in the world called harira and also those galettes. So this is one of my favorite things about Rob is he loves food. And he's good at it. A second story was more anti-Semitism when we moved to Canada. Sephardic people, although we won't wear yarmulkes during the week, on Shabbat we would wear yarmulkes all day in Montreal neighborhood. And we'd get into fights just because we had yarmulkes. So I have memories of that, and that wasn't very pleasant. And what was the third thing that you wanted to know?
Well, you had three stories to tell.
Right.
But the other thing is your own children and then your grandchildren projecting forward. Like, your kids growing up in L.A., Pico Robertson, not so many Jews over there. So have they had...
The one thing I learned from my father that I think I've taken was he had this extreme fanatic courtesy. He was a practicing, observant Orthodox Jew. I could bring a transgender female rabbi, and he would be incredibly courteous. My father was unbelievably courteous. He always put on a smile. And I think I picked up some of that. He was just courteous beyond anything. He was just unbelievably polite. He was so non-judgmental. Whoever came to the house and they could be smoking a cigarette on Shabbat, it would drive him nuts inside, but nobody ever saw it. He was just that. So I think I picked up on that a little bit, just be courteous at all times.
There's something really beautiful about that. I mean, if you go into synagogues today or just, among Jewish crowds, there's a lot of grimacing. There's a lot of kind of, unpleasant, people aren't so welcoming. And just to kind of welcome people and see them with a smile, sometimes the most disarming thing in a Jewish crowd is just to smile.
He wasn't even aware of all the fights in synagogue. We used to make jokes about it. There were so many fights happening in the synagogue in Montreal. He was one of the founders. He was always in charge of where to put the Torah, at which point and all that. And he was just like oblivious to all the fight that was going on. He was just a special man, very innocent, right to the end.
On the college campuses today, obviously, the BDS movement is something that we're reading a lot about. How worried should we be about BDS, and why? What's your take on the threat?
I was just up at Berkeley. I was just speaking at Berkeley, and the students, I got to meet with about 15 students just before I spoke. And, they have a very different view of BDS at the so-called, some right-wing website just released a list of the 10 worst campuses for Jews. And Berkeley was number 9 or number 8 or 9. And I said, is it bad for you here? And they said, no. And these were like very deeply involved Jews. They were like the head of Bears for Israel and all these other things. And one thing they really resented was that other outside Jewish defense groups or Jewish anti-BDS groups were kind of cashing in on the fear of BDS and the fear of this anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel feelings on campus, which is true at some universities and true to some extent at others, but they're kind of cashing on it as a fundraising technique and really turning other Jewish students off to going to these campuses. They've had an amazing time at Berkeley. They have a great, the place I spoke was called the Institute for Israel Studies and Law, and they have brilliant programming there. And so, I think that we have to be careful. You're getting, in some ways, when you hear about it from organizations, you're being pitched to a certain extent. So I just would say be a little careful and talk to people who are actually in these campuses, talk to professors, talk to students, and see what it's like on the ground. At the same time, BDS is a problem, and it's going to be a worse problem. It's going to grow. And I think that you have to, I've written in my columns that you have to fight BDS like there's no occupation, and you have to fight occupation like there's no BDS. But ultimately, they kind of go hand in hand. And I think that if you could deal with the occupation, you're never going to get rid of the extremists who are always going to want to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel no matter what Israel does. If it finds the cure for cancer and brings back the Messiah, they're going to want to boycott Israel. But you're going to really take a lot of the steam, most of it, 90% of it, out of the BDS movement once you deal with this occupation.
Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. This is another thing where Rob and I differ. What's the opposite of alarmist? In a way, so that I really...
Naive.
No, not naive at all. He's not naive. But, and I'm really happy that he's my partner, that he's there, because I have a tendency to be a lot more alarmist and to see real evil I really consider him the enemy, and I think BDS is a tremendously evil movement in many ways. I'm not saying all of it. There's some parts of it that really just wants to boycott the occupation, the West Bank and so forth, but so much of it, from what I've seen, they are not looking for a debate. They're really looking to just crush the image of Israel and demonize Israel. And look, I come from the world of advertising and branding. I know that it doesn't take that much to poison an image. It takes a couple of syllables. Apartheid is 3 syllables, and boycott Israel is 2 syllables. And I think it's a really sophisticated movement to malign the image of Israel, to the point where in many ways Israel has become sort of a dirty word, in America, which is kind of sad. So I really see a lot of evil in the movement. Having said all that, I think one of the great paradoxes of the Jewish experience is, on the one hand, we have reason to be victims, but on the other hand, we understand that being a victim is the worst way to be in life. Speak to any therapist, and they tell you want to fail in life, just be a victim. So we understand deep down that that's not the way to lead a successful life. the people who had the most reason to be victims were the Jews who lost 6 million in the Holocaust, but we built Israel right after. You don't build Israel by wallowing in victimhood. So I think that's one of the paradoxes and dilemmas of being Jews today, is deep down we know that playing victim isn't that productive. But on the other hand, we keep being given reasons.
Recently,
Well, I just wanted to say one thing. What David really brings to the table, among many other talents, is like this deep sense of passion. And he really connects with the passion of whatever issue and has a way to explain and convey that passion. And I think that one thing that we just have to be careful about with BDS is we think that's the only fight we have. And like I said before, it's really not the fight. Like we could, now there's this movement, which I think is smart, to get these anti-BDS measures passed in municipalities and states around the country, kind of prophylactically. We could win that fight. I think the Jews are organized enough and sophisticated enough to probably win that fight, and it's a fight we should win because the BDS people really are, there's a lot of Saudi funding from it. It's not a good group of people. But on the other hand, you win that fight and you lose democracy in Israel, what have you won?
So recently, the Israeli tourism minister, Yariv Levin, said that Reform Jews in the United States are a waning world. And he argued that assimilation among Reform Jews is so pervasive that we will soon cease to exist. Mindful, of course, of where you're sitting, to what extent do you think Levin is correct? And how worried are you about assimilation among American Jews? What extent do you see this as a reform problem?
I think he should apologize. Not that he will, but I mean, it's ludicrous. I mean, if you look, Jewish life has problems, but I think most of the problems in Jewish life in terms of continuity are we're just not making it, we have to figure out the language, and this is something David's amazing at. You have to figure out the language to convey the importance and power and beauty and meaning of Judaism to the next generation. It's been around for 3,000 years. It's not going anywhere. It's going to transform. It's going to transmogrify. It was Reform Jews, it was secular Jews who created the state of Israel that enabled somebody like Levin to go off and spout his stupidity. So you need that. I mean, Herzl was not a religious Jew. He wasn't even a Reform Jew. He wouldn't have set foot in here because he wasn't a religious Jew, period. But you need that. You really need this variety of Jewish experience in order to not just survive, but to really thrive as a culture. And fortunately, we have that.
We take things to heart. Again, Yoshi Klein Halevi said, we have this thing in the Jewish world, because maybe we got it from Sinai, where information for us, the first big information we got was a revelation from God. So ever since, when we speak, we always think it has that same status of revelation. I'm giving you the tablets from God. So, and then the other thing is, we often feel that things are a life or death issue. So you speak to my Orthodox friends in Pico Robertson, and they think of Reform Jews, it's almost like a life or death issue, because you don't follow the halacha like they do and so forth. But when you pull back and you put on your journalistic hat, you ask yourself, how is it realistic to expect that every Jew will follow the same tradition? It's just completely unrealistic. First of all, it would be a really boring community if we were all the same. So I think what we have now is this incredible diversity. Now, my friend Yosef Kanevsky, he's an Orthodox Jew who actually really engages. There are two kinds of pluralists in the Orthodox community, because that's my world. There's the fake pluralist and the real pluralist. You'll find, when I say a real pluralist, it's an Orthodox Jew who values a Reform Jew. Values, not tolerates or accepts, values, right? And Yosef Kanevsky is one of them. And he had a great comment once. He said, I don't care if you're Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, just be passionate. And I think I've been to a lot of Reform communities where you're really passionate about your Judaism, however you express it. So I think if we can maintain a level of passion, there are things you do that we can't do, we in the Orthodox community. First of all, you can play any instrument you like on Friday night, which is incredible. I wish we could. It'd be the Beatles every Friday night and Pico Robertson. That's an incredible thing. You're allowed to do that. Take advantage. I also think that we're in a time where we should exchange. Rob and I, every time, we both love Sukkot, the holiday of Sukkot. But, so often I go to my Reform friends and I say, don't give up Sukkot to the Orthodox. I say, well, I don't build a Sukkah because I'm Reform, right? Don't be a slave to your label. So go ahead and borrow in the same way that we can learn from you. You can learn from us as well. And I think that's one of the things we try to do at the Jewish Journal is sort of open it up and take a lot of these sort of halachic traditions and share them with the whole community. And I think that's what we're seeing. Look, I just came from the board meeting, by the way. I think it was the first time in Jewish American history where the two top journalists were inside a financial board meeting of a synagogue. And they trusted us. I don't know why. They trusted us.
I think it's the first time two Jews went to a board meeting they didn't have to go to.
Yeah, absolutely. We were there. But what did I see? You had the same tea glasses that we had in Morocco with mint, fresh mint, right? So I'm thinking, here's an Ashkenazi shul. So we're living to a time of exchange right now where it's this grand family reunion where my ancestors in Morocco never met an Ashkenazi Jew. And I got called by a Reform Jew temple last year that wanted to do a Mimuna party, which is this hardcore Moroccan tradition that I grew up with in Casablanca. So we're really in this state of exchange, and in the same way that we learn Tikkun Olam from you, you can all build a sukkah this year.
And the other lie, what he said, which is so ludicrous, is there's a lot of people who flow out of Orthodoxy. And it's not like Orthodoxy keeps the people who are in Orthodoxy. Most of us came from ancestors who were traditional Orthodox, and they left it. And when I was in Israel, the first friend I made was a guy who came from a family of 13, a Haredi family from Mea Shearim, but he had left it. And it just kind of opened my eyes like, yeah, it's not like that's kind of some kind of glorious standard and then they just stick. There's a lot of flow in and out of it as well.
The one thing I will say, though, is Nachum Breverman once said, you don't give to someone because you love them because you give to them. So I think the one thing that there is in Orthodoxy is you're constantly giving to Judaism. And all those rituals that you do makes you invested in Judaism, so you're more likely to love it and stick around because you just keep giving. And I've noticed from what I hear in the Reform movement, there's rituals of sort of, right? There seems to be a little bit of a revival. So, but again, I say this in the spirit of exchange. I say this as a spirit of curiosity where you can open up the Jewish Journal and find out what the Orthodox do, and it belongs to all of us. All the rituals belong to all the Jews. And we shouldn't be a slave to our labels. I shouldn't say, well, I don't do this because Orthodox Jews don't do that and so forth. So I think we have the opportunity in today's generation to really sort of open things up. But I will make a point that rituals are really, really important in terms of binding you to your tradition.
David, you talked just now about giving and taking, and I read through a lot of your old pieces as well. In 2003, on Valentine's Day, you wrote about giving and taking. You wrote about Jewish diversity and how beautiful it is. And you said, when Jews with different opinions and experiences come together, there's a moment of beauty that's experienced. And then you said, just what you said right now, you said, when it comes to give and take...
My God, I'm consistent.
It says, you wrote, when it comes to give and take, you need to take from others. And this is what you wrote. I'm quoting from your article from 2003. So my friends, I'm inviting you this Shabbat to begin by taking from your fellow Jew. Instead of, I'll give to you so you can see what you've been missing, let's try, I'll take from you so I can see what I've been missing. The path to true love...
Line.
It's a good line.
It's a great line.
The path to true love, you wrote, is not through change, but through exchange. It's a good line, too.
It's a good line.
And if this means... Wait, I'm not done with you. And if this means that you'll occasionally be taking from another shul or another rabbi, you should know that I'll be doing the same. Happy Valentine's Day.
Whoa.
You obviously still believe this because you just said it. I want to know how this informs your relationship with each other, this notion of giving and taking. What do you take from Rob? And Rob, what are some things you take from David?
I just can't believe he wrote a Valentine's Day column. for
I
David
wrote another
Suissa.
one last week. Yeah,
Happy
love
Valentine's
story.
Day.
Love story.
No,
That was
look, David has been inspirational. Like I said, his passion. Two things come to mind. One is his passion. I mean, he doesn't do anything halfway, and he deeply loves the people he loves. He gives wholeheartedly. He was writing a column. I had asked him to write a column based on the neighborhood he was living in, Pico Robertson.
Hold on, I got to tell you this. I got to interrupt. He's responsible for everything. Seriously. And I've said this many, many times, and I'll say it to you for the first time. I moved to Pico Robertson from the coolest neighborhood in LA, which was West Hollywood. So I went from all the fancy sushi bars and everything. And my first week, I had 5 kids that I was going to raise alone, and I needed a Jewish neighborhood. So I immediately moved to Pico Robertson, and there you go. Instead of going to sushi bars, I'm going to Nagila Pizza, and I'm saying, what am I doing in a shtetl, right? So I was going to Earth Cafe every morning. Now I'm going to this other Jewish place. So I write a column called Welcome to the Hood, and I make fun of the whole neighborhood. And I sent it to Rob. This was 9.5 years ago. And he said, Suissa, I love this. I always wanted to have a column on a neighborhood. Can you write it every week? I said, every week, maybe every month. He said, no, write it every week. That way you'll always be thinking about it. Anyhow, I haven't missed a week in 9.5 years, seriously. Since that phone call, it was just a quick 2-minute phone call with Rob Eshman. I was on Doheny and Cascio, and he says, come on, write it every week. Just amazing how life changes, and just the column sort of took on a life of its own, and I ended up writing. And then I said, I can't write about the neighborhood every week. He said, write about whatever you feel passionate about that week. And that's what I still do. Yeah. So forgive the commercial interruption.
No, but it's true. And then and then I was looking for somebody to kind of oversee the business side of the journal, and he didn't have to do it. He had basically retired after selling his company, but he saw that this is the way to everything that the journal stands for, everything the journal does in the community is something that David, strongly believes. Sharing, getting the whole buffet of the Jewish experience out there to everybody, being a central place where everybody could dialogue and discuss and argue. And he came on, and I think the other thing, what I've taken from him is from that column, you could see that he has a way of, I think it's years and years in the advertising and marketing business. It doesn't matter what you think if you can't express it well. It doesn't matter what you believe if you can't get others to understand it in a powerful way. And he is just a master at it. In fact, one of the things we do at the Journal is do advertise. We take on clients and do their branding and advertising. And he'll listen to their problem and come up with a marketing slogan so quickly we can't charge enough money for it because it was so easy for him. And I tell him, pretend that you have to struggle to come up with it a little bit.
But I think one of the most underrated character traits is curiosity. We have the glamorous character traits of, integrity and honesty and compassion and so forth, which are wonderful. But I think curiosity is one of my favorites, because when you're curious, that's when you can receive from someone. I got to tell you, if you really want to honor somebody, have them sing one of their melodies to you. Taste their cuisine, hear their stories. That was what the rabbi was alluding to just earlier, and that's really true love, because it's much easier to give than to receive. When you receive, maybe you might hear something you don't like. And I think this is sort of one of my big things in life, is I try to promote sort of curiosity, and we can receive from each other.
It's also a way of showing, I think, deep respect, when you honor someone by paying attention to their story. I'll take some of that great soup later on, if you don't mind.
We have, it's
the
amazing
recipe
soup.
online.
Yeah, that's great.
His wife loves it.
So Foodtopia, that's your blog?
Foodism.
Foodism, okay. I knew it was something that had the word
Judaism,
food in it,
foodism.
and that was,
Yeah, there you go.
foodism actually sounds better than
But it's
Foodtopia.
painful to take, and I'll tell you, it's not easy, because a lot of times I feel very, very strongly about an issue, and Rob will make a really good point. Like on the Iran case, for instance, I just hated the deal, right? I was so against it. And then he'd say, well, they're on the 1-yard line. If we don't make the deal, they're just going to go over the 1-yard line. And it can happen as quick as 3 months. And I would just sit there and say, he makes a really, really good point. So sometimes it's painful to take. It's much easier not to take and just hang around people who completely agree with you. Because if you hang around smart people who disagree with you, they're going to really complicate your life. And it's not pleasant. It's not pleasant.
So this past December, one of your columnists, Dennis Prager, wrote a piece entitled "The Torah and the Transgendered," and you've received, you told me, over 1,000 letters about the piece. One of I think it might be the column that got the most feedback that you've ever had, or certainly one of the top ones. And many of the readers who wrote, and I read through some of the comments on the website. I didn't see the handwritten notes that they sent to you, but many of the readers expressed pain and even anger, really, that you published the article in the first place. Do you have any regrets about that piece?
No, something must be wrong with me. I just don't. I mean, I fully understood that it was going to cause people some pain because, you know, I think we're living in a time and culture now where you're just not supposed to make people feel uncomfortable about their choices. And if you do, you're wrong. And I just think that when you are breaking ground and you're pushing the boundaries of what's considered acceptable in society, which I am all for, you're going to get pushback. And a newspaper is the place to air that pushback and to be able to respond to it. If not us, where? What David said is so true. You know, we're all very comfortable in our silos, whether you're on the left or whether you're on the right. And this is really a case where kind of the left came after me.
I wish you would have been there. Rob is the most liberal, tolerant, decent liberal I know. I'll say liberal twice, seriously. I never thought he'd get criticism from the left. There was an LGBT group that came in one day, late in the day, and I never thought I would see that in my life. And they took him on, which I think was totally unfair and unnecessary. But Rob could look at something he completely disagrees with. Rob's views on the column was as liberal and tolerant as they get. I don't know any human being who's more tolerant than Rob, and I say that as a compliment. But he totally disagreed with it, but he also understands that there's a whole constituency in Los Angeles who agrees with Prager. So he was representing a point of view, you know, well, without applause, but he was representing a point of view that was, you know, prevalent in the Jewish community, and Rob's able to totally disagree with Prager and still sort of publish it, and it's complicated because we feel obligated to sort of put it out there, you know?
Yeah, I mean, this is really easy for us because I love David and we work together all the time. If I was up here with Dennis Prager, it would be a different conversation. But I edit Dennis Prager, and I am proud, I guess that's the right word, to put him in the paper, and I get probably more calls to take him out of the paper than any other columnist.
And you know, there's curiosity. I think so much, you know, there's this syndrome in the Jewish world, we're done, you know. So I'm done. I have 3 seconds and I'm done. Donald Trump is a racist blowhard, I'm done. You sort of take your brain and just move on. No curiosity about why is he so successful, what is the phenomenon behind Donald Trump, boom, I'm done. So Dennis Prager, another racist bigot, I'm done. I'm done. So there's this I'm done phenomenon where we've lost any sense of curiosity. And I think we are diminished by losing that sense of curiosity. We're diminished. So there are things that Dennis Prager was trying to say that were not totally bigoted, that made sense. But if you just keep turning your brain off, so I just think that
it was pretty bigoted.
It was.
But here's the point. But the point was he was going to publish it somewhere. He's going to publish his views. I mean, Dennis is one of the leading, you know, in terms of his ratings. He's probably the 6th or 7th highest rated radio personality in the country. So in terms of this Jewish community, the one we live in, nobody has a bigger microphone to the outside world on these issues than Dennis Prager. So having him in the Jewish Journal means that the people who admire everything he says have to read the other voices that are in the journal, and the people that despise everything he says have to confront his arguments as a way to to sharpen their own. You had mentioned Scalia when we were in the Justice Scalia when we were in the back, and I thought one thing I read in one of the obituaries of him, was that he always made sure to hire a liberal law clerk. On every time he would hire law clerks, he had to make sure to have one liberal, and there was usually a Jew, I noticed. And he said he did it to sharpen his own arguments. And I think that's an important, there's an important message in that.
It's a very Jewish notion. There's, in the Talmud, Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, that's their relationship. And when Reish Lakish is gone, Yochanan is comforted by a student who comes and agrees with every argument he makes. And he says, I don't need you to agree with me. I need you to disagree with me.
I just want to say one time, I did a debate between David Wolpe and Christopher Hitchens. I was moderating this debate. And right out, it was, they were both brilliant. And right afterwards, I heard somebody come up to Christopher Hitchens and say, I loved everything you said. And he said, never say that to me. Yeah. Tell me where I was wrong.
Life is so much more interesting when you just read stuff you disagree with. And, I have this crazy fetish for reading left-wing websites like Salon. And I'm just really fascinated with it. I read this piece last night on Bernie Sanders. Rob's got a Feel the Burn coffee cup on his desk.
Just because I like campaign coffee cups.
So it
not
was
an
fascinating.
endorsement.
I would never have read it if I just stick to my usual websites. It was just a fascinating takedown of Bernie Sanders, which is that his whole shtick of being authentic is an act. It's an act.
You can't fake sincerity, though, David.
Yeah. Once you can fake it, you got it made. He said it's really an act because the guy knows damn well. He's not an outsider. He's a senator. He's in the Senate. He's inside the system. He knows that America is not designed for revolution, that we have a system of checks and balances. You don't go into a White House to create a revolution. So he knows it's not realistic, all these incredible promises that he's making, but he's making them anyways. Whether you agree with that point or not, I just thought it was a fascinating idea, and I would never have heard it if I just stuck to my sort of usual websites.
Just a few more questions, and then we have an oneg, and we can continue the conversation next door. I want to ask a question about American politics, and then I want to touch on, you mentioned Supreme Court Justice Scalia, so I want to touch on that as well. But in the American political system today, there's debate, of course, it's an election year, and there's a debate about how we should deal with immigrants, and especially refugees from the Middle East, Syrian refugees. What are your thoughts, answering both from the perspective of American policy, and then also thinking about Israeli policy and how you might respond if you were being asked that question in Israel, how Israel should respond to the refugee crisis?
I think I wrote about this, that we could do a lot better than we're doing, and it's really, I'm one of those people that believes the greatest resource of any country is its human resources, and that when you look at our lives are surrounded by immigrants here, and we all have we all know immigrants who have exceeded beyond their wildest dreams in America, and some of us are those immigrants, David, and the idea that that we can't, it seems like pure xenophobia that we're not letting more of these people in. In Canada, they're letting many more of them in, and it's not going to endanger Canada. Obviously, you don't want a situation like Europe where people are just spilling over the border, but we're not looking at that. I mean, the rules and regulations and vetting process in America is very stringent. So if we say we're going to apply those same stringent rules, but we're going to let 10,000 or 100,000 in, I don't understand what the problem is. I think it's only going to help America. I mean, I think the American Jewish experience is an immigrant success story, and I don't understand why we're not doing it now.
There's a great piece by Rabbi Steinsaltz. It's actually a speech he made that got transcribed on the two kinds of languages in the world. You have poetic language and you have scientific language. And, scientific language is very precise and poetic language makes you dream. And he was getting to a point where too often we get seduced by poetic language. And I think this area of immigration is one of them, because there's such poetry to the idea that America was created by immigrants, and it's true in so many ways. But if you get sort of hung up on the poetry, then you end up having a situation where you just can't manage the situation. In Israel, for example, they started with poetry, and these poor, Eritrean and Sudanese refugees were getting, murdered throughout the desert, and they came when they crossed into Israel. An IDF soldier would give them some water. It was nice, and then it became 50,000, and then what happened? The word gets out, it can get to be 100,000, 150,000. It's hard to manage. So I think that's where the poetry stops and the science begins, and I think we have but Rob is really aware of that, because he just said in his answer that it's all a question of, the boundaries, the limits, how do we do it? For example, if we find out that there's a high likelihood that ISIS terrorists might want to infiltrate to the refugees that come in, these are like real issues that we have to sort of deal with in a non-xenophobic way, just in a very practical, not in a Trump way, but it's sort of in a very practical way, and realize that, we have to vet them extra carefully. And obviously the ones who committed the crime in San Bernardino were not vetted that well. So there is genuine concern that the vetting system in America is not strong enough. So these are like complex issues, and I think, we can't sort of go either all poetry or all science. And I think that's the mark of Judaism. Jewish leadership and Jewish journalism can help all of us sort of come to this complex middle place where it's just not one or the other.
One last question, and then I'll close with a quote from one of your articles. This past week, of course, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia died. Given how polarized our country is today, what would be your advice to President Obama about how to proceed?
Boy, he so doesn't need advice from me on that. I think that Obama's, after 8 years, has really figured out that you
Does he still call you a lot for
Yeah.
the weekly?
He got invited to the Hanukkah party this year.
Yeah.
I was the one last year, yeah.
I think that you just keep your eye on the ball. And the ball is when you need to replace a Supreme Court justice, you replace a Supreme Court justice. And I think he has a great, I think he has an understanding that the American people are in favor of stability and in favor, it's essentially, we're in this weird world where he's making the conservative argument, which is just, let's do what it says in the Constitution, let's do the way it should be done, and ignore all the noise on all the sides. And I think that's what's going to happen. He's going to nominate somebody who's acceptable, and after all the screaming and Sturm und Drang, they're going to put him through.
I feel America is entering this state of decay. There's such incredible cynicism towards the media, towards politicians, towards big money. And I just don't like where the country's going right now. I don't know if that is connected to your question, but it's just a thought that popped into my head. And maybe that's why sort of I have a conservative instinct to sort of conserve what we've got. I think just the capitalism is good up to a point, but the profit motive is so intense that you end up having a CNN roundtable where all they talk about after a debate is the horse race, because they know that's better for ratings. So it's just like a confluence of factors, and then the politicians, they need big money to stay, in business, and then the big money has their own incentives. So I think capitalism has gone so far that we've lost sight of the greatness of this country, and I think this is where spirituality can come in, where you have an inner desire to do good, just independent of money. There's a major flaw in democracy, which is if you're 5 years old, you can't vote. So there's no lobby of 30 million 5-year-olds that have a lot of money and a lot of votes. So if you don't have adults who have a sense of principle that said, even though these 5-year-olds are useless for me in terms of getting reelected, out of principle, I'm going to stick up for them. So I think we're losing that because money is an intoxicating, power. And we're seeing it corrode everything. And that's why you're seeing people like Sanders and Trump come up to the surface, because they've created these incredible enemies that are genuine. So Trump's got the enemy of big money, which he comes from, and he says, Sanders, the enemy of big money, and media and politicians. And I think so when I think about the Supreme Court, I'm always going to lean a little conservative because I want to slow down. I think we're just going too fast right now in this direction. And I don't want to pull it back. Maybe it should be the rabbis. The rabbis need to sort of pull things back and return us to some sort of principled way of living that has nothing to do with money.
I think what David's saying is we should put a 5-year-old on the Supreme Court. Give him a voice.
So let me conclude with some words that you wrote, and then I'm going to invite Cantor Lamb to help us conclude with some words from our tradition that I think will give us some hope, and then we'll do what Jews do best. We'll conclude with dessert next door. This past September, right before Rosh Hashanah, you wrote a column together, and this is what you wrote. When we all stand before God this Yom Kippur, let's do something different. Let's go beyond our own personal accounting and think of our fellow Jews. Let's imagine a giant tent in the desert that for thousands of years has managed to shelter every Jew on earth, regardless of color, creed, denomination, or political views. Let's imagine all the arguing and debating inside the tent and appreciate its diversity. Let's marvel at the miracle that such a noisy tent could have endured and contributed to the world for so long. And let's pray that we can all see the value of keeping this noisy and diverse tent standing, and that our community will have the collective wisdom to keep moving forward together.
Wow.
So I'm going to ask everyone to stand up, but don't go anywhere yet, and don't applaud yet. Cantor Lamb, please come forward. David and Rob, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thank you for the service that you provide, not just, now you can clap. The service that you provide, not just the Los Angeles Jewish community, but the broader Jewish community, because there are people who visit you online from all across the world, and the debate that you encourage and the way you model what it means to not be just tolerant of each other, David, but to truly be pluralistic, which is to be willing to take from one another and give from one another, is truly a gift. I know that there are ways we can support that gift by supporting the work of the Jewish Journal, and everyone's invited to do that. But I want to conclude with words from our tradition, Oseh Shalom Bimromav. God makes peace and wholeness in heaven, and here on earth, we ask God's help, but we also look to one another to find ways to bring shalom here on us, on all of Israel, on all of humanity, and we'll say amen together.
Naomi Shemer tonight.
Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru amen. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, yaseh shalom. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael.
Thank you so much.
Nice.